Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased you've joined us today. I'm Rebecca Goldberg, Executive Director at the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley. Thank you for joining us today for this special webinar entitled, What's Dividing the Jewish World? How Should We Overcome the Tensions Between Values and Peoplehood? In today's talk, Donniel Hartman, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, and Ethan Katz, professor of history at UC Berkeley, join me for a frank conversation about Jewish values and peoplehood in this fraught global moment. They will explore the tensions dividing the Jewish world and suggest Jewish pathways forward. Who do Jews want to be, and how do Jews want to show up in the world? For fellow Jews, for other communities in need, and in democratic and pluralistic spaces. How should Jews respond to internal division, to Israel, and to extremism? Today's webinar is co-sponsored with the Center for Jewish Studies and the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion at UC Berkeley. We are grateful for their partnership. The Helen Diller Institute provides a rich academic forum for students and faculty to explore the breadth and complexity of Israel and contemporary Jewish topics through its two programs, one in Israel Studies and the other on Jewish law, thought, and identity. The Institute houses an undergraduate fellowship of 35 students, brings visiting faculty from Israeli and U.S. universities to teach and research at Berkeley, hosts the university's undergraduate minor in Israel Studies, and offers dozens of lectures and programs for the public and campus communities. Other upcoming programs this semester will include the annual Robbins Collection Lecture in Jewish Law, Thought, and Identity with Princeton Professor of Religion Lior Batnitsky, and the annual Levitsky Lecture on Israel and the Great Powers with Stanford Professor of Israel Studies Amichai Magen. Please refer to our website, social media, and email blasts for upcoming programs and for recordings of past programs. All of the programs, activities, and events of our institute are dependent on philanthropic support from the community. We thank you for your continued support. I'm excited to introduce you to our speakers now. Rabbi Dr. Donniel Hartman is president of the Shalom Hartman Institute and holds the Kaufman Family Chair in Jewish Philosophy. He is author of The Boundaries of Judaism and Putting God First, How to Save Religion from Itself. His latest book, Who Are the Jews and Who Can We Become, was a 2023 Jewish Book Council Award finalist. Donniel is also the host of the award-winning podcast, For Heaven's Sake, together with his colleague Yossi Klein Halevi, which ranks consistently as one of the top Judaism podcasts in the world. Donniel is the founder of some of the most extensive education, training, and enrichment programs for scholars, educators, rabbis, and religious and lay leaders in Israel and North America. He is a prominent essayist, blogger, and lecturer on issues of the Israeli politics, policy, Judaism, and the Jewish community. I am so pleased he is joining us today. Ethan Katz is Associate Professor in the Department of History and Faculty Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley. He is the author of The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, which received a number of prizes, including a National Jewish Book Award. Ethan has co-edited 3 other books, including Colonialism and the Jews, which was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award, and most recently, When Jews Argue, Between the University and the Beit Midrash. Ethan has taken a leadership role in contemporary discussions of anti-Semitism and debates around Israel and Palestine on college campuses. He is co-founder of 2 pioneering programs at Berkeley that have helped to inspire other educators around the country. First, the Antisemitism Education Initiative, a program designed to improve the conversation about anti-Semitism on the Berkeley campus through thoughtful education and engagement, and the Berkeley Bridging Fellowship, a year-long program that brings together a diverse group of students for engaged discussions about Israel, Palestine, the conflict, and interconnected histories. Thank you both for being here. This conversation is long awaited. Welcome. I'm really happy that you are both here. So I want to start by asking each of you, what's on your mind? What keeps you up at night? Either of you can jump
Who
in.
should start?
Donniel, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, first of all, the first thing that's keeping me up at night is whether I have enough water. Because we don't know if and when there's going to be a war and what the consequence of an Iranian bombing is going to be. So one of the ways in which you deal with different levels of anxiety is you buy things. Like I can't control my world, but I can control how many bottles of water I have and how many canned goods I have, etc. So that's and it's strange because that is always part of your mind, or in the last while, it's just there all the time. And at the same time, while I'm worried about water and my borders and my kids and all of the above, on a larger level, a thing that's been concerning me more and more is mediocrity. It's who do we want to be and what's the gap between who do we want to be and who we are? And it's really difficult in the midst of existential questions and people being pushed to deal with the most base survival Maslowian stuff, to actually ask themselves, who do you want to be? And my love of Israel and the essence, we'll talk about this, the essence of my Zionism is that it's an aspiration for the Jewish people to be more. And what's on my mind is how do we put that conversation back on the table of the Jewish people? And in particular, I live in Israel, of the people who live in Israel and of those who love Israel. Um, that's on my mind.
Ethan.
Yes. Thank you, Donniel. And first, I just want to say it's an honor to be in conversation with you.
Thank you.
I've long admired your work.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one of the things that's most on my mind is how divided the Jewish world has become, and how those divisions have, in the last 2.5 years, since October 7th, become much deeper and much more entrenched and seemingly intractable. We're Jews. We love to argue. That isn't new. That's fine. And argument and debate are often very healthy and they're necessary for us. But we're not actually mostly arguing with each other across a lot of our divides now. We're not speaking to each other. We're not hearing each other. We're not seeing each other. And we're often very uninclined to hear or see each other. And one of the big divides, of course, is around our position on Israel, our understanding of what's going on in Israel. And so that worries me a lot. It's something that's preoccupied a lot of my thinking and writing over the last 2.5 years. And I think mediocrity is a good word, Donniel, because a lot of the words that we use when we start talking about our concerns about Israel, about the Jewish world, are value judgment words, right? We say, I'm most worried about anti-Zionism. I'm most worried about this type of Zionism, right? I'm most worried about anti-Semitism. And then we're off to the races with lots of built-in accusations and value judgments. Mediocrity, I think, is useful because it helps us to reflect on ourselves and kind of where we are. I live in the American Jewish community. I have very deep ties to Israel. My wife and my kids are all Israeli, but I live here. And so when I think about mediocrity, I think about the quality of our conversations and the quality of the conversations that a lot of our institutions and leaders are enabling or facilitating. I want to be clear. There are many great things going on in the American Jewish community. I love the shul community that I belong to, and I think it's a very special place where a lot of really good conversations are happening. And I feel privileged to be in certain spaces where that is taking place. But when I look at a lot of our institutions, we're going to talk a lot about values and peoplehood here. That's sort of part of our frame, right? And I think something that you and I share, Donniel, is a deep commitment to a Judaism and a Zionism that tries to hold up both peoplehood and values and to see those as essential. And I think part of our mediocrity right now is many folks in our community have felt they had to settle for one or the other in a certain way. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but have basically said, all we can focus on right now is peoplehood, and the critiques that allegedly come from a place of values, those scare me too much. Get away from me. You're not one of the people. Or all I can focus on is the values issues because a lot of my people, I don't understand what they're doing. They don't sound like my people. And so I think when we talk about mediocrity, part of what we're talking about is we need a more challenging and robust intellectual and spiritual life that really is bringing these issues into much greater conversation and holding up the tensions that we're living through.
Even it's even just asking that question. Who do you want to be? In philosophy, one of the central distinctions is between is and ought.
Mhm.
I know who I am, but where is there a space in our community just like who do we want to be?
Yeah,
And when I look back, I can understand Israelis. I really can. It's been such a hard few years.
totally.
It's just been so hard. And and I meet soldiers and I meet families of kids and spouses and the whole, I was at a friend of mine is a grandparent, and I go to his grandchild's funeral. Like that's not supposed to be. That's like in our world, you're not supposed to go to your grandchild. And I'm looking and I understand, like, leave me alone. And I'm not in the mood for you to criticize my kids. My kids or my husband, my wife,
Yeah.
200-300 days, just I want some more hugging. And I can understand that. But at the end, at what point do we come back to even have the psychological space to begin to ask the questions, who are we? Who should we be? And how do those begin to guide what we do? And it's the lack of that conversation is for me one of the greatest dangers facing the Jewish people today.
I want to bring you more deeply into this question. We titled this conversation around tensions between Jewish values and Jewish peoplehood. And I would like you to dig in a little bit more to actually define what do you mean by Jewish values? What do you mean by Jewish peoplehood? How do you distinguish between these two terms? Why and when are they in conflict?
Ethan, you want to start?
Sure, although I'm probably going to draw a little bit on your recent book, Donniel.
That's
So
why I asked you to do that, just to give me a little nachas.
right. So I think you have a useful formulation, a lot of useful formulations, but a useful formulation very much on this topic in your book when you talk about the Genesis covenant and Exodus covenant, Exodus Judaism, right? And in short, and I know I'm not doing justice to a book that I encourage everybody to look at and read, but in short, the Genesis covenant is this idea that we are bound inextricably by our kinship, in a sense, by blood, by anybody who opts into the group. You're part of the Jewish people, and you're bound, in religious terms, you're bound to God, and in terms of some kind of sense of nationhood or peoplehood, we're bound to each other, no matter what we do or think or believe. Exodus covenant is about our values. It's about who we are. It's about the choices we make. It's about deciding to adopt some version of what some people call ethical monotheism, or specifically a set of Jewish values that we draw from the Torah and the Talmud and our intellectual traditions, right? And so, in a sense, I think those are useful frames for what we think about when we think about peoplehood and values. And in today's world, the most common expressions of peoplehood are sometimes attached to notions about community in local or national contexts, but they're very often connected to Zionism, right? They're very often connected to our sense of attachment to Israel and sometimes to diaspora-Israel relationship. And values are very often expressed as something that for many people is intellectual. It's expressed as ethics. These are my Jewish ethics. These are my Jewish values. For some people, they come from a place of deep religiosity. From some people, they come from a place of deep secularism, right? But people invoke Jewish values in a whole range of ways. And so for me, the tension that we see today is if we want to get right down to sort of where we sit in February 2026 in the wake of the last 2.5 years, we have many people who have experienced the last 2.5 years primarily from the standpoint of I'm part of the Jewish people who were attacked on October 7th. That is where my loyalty lies. I might be critical here or there, but really, in a time of war, my first loyalty is to defend Israel and to defend the state of the Jewish people. And we have people who, at some point, some of them on October 8th, some of them a year later, reach the sense that my values are being violated. My values that I think are Jewish values are being violated in some way by what Israel's doing. There's a whole range of what those critiques look like. But therefore, yes, I know I'm attached to Israel in some way, but for me at this point, my position on the war, my position on the conflict is driven by values. So that's what and I don't think part of our problem, to extend what you just spoke about, Donniel, is that we're all living with relatively immediate and intergenerational trauma. We're all in really intense pain. We all have intense fears connected to that trauma, different types of fears. And we are also not really able to talk about that and acknowledge that and how that's part of what's driving our choices and the conversations we're in and that we're not in. So, all those things and this tension, this question you're asking, who do I want to be? And recognizing there is a tension between my attachment to values and my attachment to people. Those are the conversations we're not having, I think partly because we're feeling so traumatized and we're in so much pain and fear.
Ethan, you used a word that I love, and it's really central to my Jewish life, and that's the word loyalty. I think it's an essential term to all political, to any collective existence,
Yes.
whether to my kids, to my wife, to my family, to my community, to my people. And for me, my Judaism really starts with that sense of loyalty. It's to stand up and just be. It's not just to be there, it's to be with, to be behind, to support,
Yep.
to do
Yep.
everything you can.
Yep.
And that's I think the essence of that. That's the value of social life.
Mm.
So that's a core value. I join a community to be a member is to accept upon yourself
Yes.
the moral obligation of loyalty.
Yes.
And I feel that is such it's such a big part of who I am and the way I look at my Judaism. And part of the conflict is that my love for my people obligates me, or my loyalty for my people also obligates me to expect. It's like every one of us as parents has this struggle all the time. So I live in Israel, and so we're not politically correct. So I apologize. Like I'm not up to date with all the right nuances. But I don't know. I hope it's okay if I say I'm a maternal father. Did I just cross some line or something?
I think you're fine.
I think I'm fine. Good. You'll just tell me. Just beat me out or something. I tell my kid, if you have a problem, I'm your first call. I'm there. I don't care. It's like, with the exception of riding a motorcycle, if there's anything that you ever do, I'm on your side, by definition. Now, I feel that with the Jewish people. I really do. That's my start. That's my default. And part of my love for my people is just like a parent, is that I want us to fulfill the best of what we can be. And so it's very often, and you're right, Ethan, that we're often told to choose between our peoplehood and our values. And that's the way the discussion is posited. But I think you and I, that's like it's setting up a conflict that shouldn't be there. Because when I care about what my country does, when I care about what people do, when I care about who we are, that's also expression of loyalty. In Israel, there's a very interesting, this is something that almost every single lecture I give now in Israel, somebody raises to me. when I'm talking about these types of issues is, you know, another way of version is security versus morality. When is the time to give up morality for the sake of security? And part of what I say to them is, what are you talking about? When security is self-defense, that's a moral obligation. But by creating this dichotomy, you're giving license to give up for the sake of peoplehood, survival, or whatever it might be, this moral aspiration when they have to be intersected. So there is no doubt when push, I'm all in, but being all in means being all in the totality of my concerns for my people. And I think the more we get back to that, there might be more room, Ethan, to overcome some of the concerns. And I think the frustration that I heard in your voice, because I know it's not easy being far away and then who's loyal? It's like, right? Isn't that the question? Are you loyal? You're a betrayal and all of the above. It's like all of them are loyal. The question is priorities within loyalty, etc.
I want to extend this conversation. It's already heading in that direction, but to bring in the concept of Zionism within this notions of loyalty and notions of belonging. Both of you write quite a lot about Zionism and think about Zionism. And I wonder if you can talk about your approaches to Zionism and to exploring the challenges and paradoxes within.
Ethan, I'm just giving you the choice. Would you like to start? Would you want me to start? What's better for you?
Sure, I can start. Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, Zionism is at the most basic level historically, and I think still today, an expression of an aspiration and a defense and a building of Jews' right to self-determination and security and thriving with Jewish sovereignty in some portion of our historic home of what we call the land of Israel. Now, Zionism has been many things historically, and even what I just said is not true for all Zionists historically, and probably not true for everybody who identifies themselves as a Zionist today. But as far as Jews go, as far as our experience, that has been the overwhelming orientation of Zionism since its founding as a political movement in the late 19th century. And I think it's the way that most Israelis in some fashion understand Zionism today. And I think most people who define themselves as Zionists understand it that way. The great challenge for us, of course, is that there's another very large group of people whose fate has been shaped and deeply affected by Zionism, and they have experienced it very differently. And that is, of course, Palestinian Arabs who have experienced Zionism really, I think, as an unremitting story of colonization, dispossession, violence, and frequently, tremendous inequality and persecution. And that's very hard for us. Those of us who identify strongly as Zionists, it's very hard for us to accept the second piece as much a real history, as much a real version of what Zionism is and has become as the Zionism that we love, right? And what I see and part of the divides that we're talking about here, and the conversations that don't take place, is we have versions of Zionism that operate in total echo chambers from each other. The book I'm finishing now is really centered on paradoxes in the question of Zionism and colonialism. And what I'm urging us to do, everybody in the conversation, is own the paradox, own the paradoxes, understand, be real about the fact that Zionism is all these things at once, because we cannot make a better world for Israelis and Palestinians when we cannot even be honest with each other about the fact that for Jews, Zionism is a cherished national liberation movement, an expression of our love of our ancestral homeland that has now become a thriving modern nation state, and that it is simultaneously something profoundly different and a source of profound dispossession, violence, and destruction among Palestinians. So for me, that's really at the center of it. I do want to mention now, and we maybe can come back to it, that Donniel, I imagine you saw the recent survey from Jewish Federations of North America that showed that 37% of American Jews identify as Zionists, and about 90% of American Jews say Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish democratic state. And I think that's important because I do think, as much as I continue to talk about my Zionism and contradictions of Zionism, I think that survey and some other data that we're getting may be telling us that we need to think harder about whether we're using the best terms or not. Because if the disconnect is that big between what we think Zionism is and how people are identifying, then that's telling us something important.
Right now, so I want to make the gap even larger if I can, because first of all, I'm part of a people who call themselves a stiff-necked people. I don't give up on my categories because somebody doesn't like them. Like, I'm stiff-necked, I'm stubborn. But more than that, you're asking a serious question whether we're being constructive or not. So let me go back to what I think Zionism is, and I want to change or expand what we think we're talking about. And I'm in the midst of having these conversations with Israelis all the time right now. I think we have a very narrow definition of Zionism. For me, and similar to what you said, Zionism is a commitment to the right of the Jewish people to be sovereign in our homeland. And it sees that sovereignty as a value and a Jewish value, integral to building a rich and total Jewish life. Now, to be sovereign in our homeland has two dimensions, and very often we only speak of one. And that is, to be sovereign is to worry about the Jews, is to worry about the safety of the Jews. Even to expand it, let's say, to worry about the values of the Jews. But Zionism is inherently a movement which worries about the Jews. But the minute Zionism is a movement to embrace sovereignty, that means Zionism is a movement in which the Jewish people expand our definition of who our people is. To be a Zionist is not merely to embrace being a member of the Jewish people, but it's to embrace being a member of Israeli society. So to be a Zionist, because of my Zionism, I embrace the second questions that you pose as somehow challenging to Zionism. Like there was, as you all know, I spoke about this in one of my podcasts. There's been a tremendous increase in violence in the Arab community, in the Israeli Arab Palestinian community, and there was a day of striking in solidarity, and the strikes were in the Israeli Arab Palestinian, mainly in their communities, and we allowed every member of the Hartman Institute to strike, to take the day off, and it won't be considered a personal day. And there weren't a lot of Jewish institutions which did that. And so I was asked on the radio, to speak on the radio, to explain why I'm doing that. And my answer was, you know why I'm doing it? Because I'm a Zionist. The guy says, what are you talking about? He says, what do you think Zionism is? Zionism is about being committed to sovereignty. That means Israeli Arab Palestinians are one of us. They're me. I have dual loyalty. I have a loyalty to the Jewish people in Israel. I have a Jewish people to Jewish people around the world. And I have a loyalty to the new children of Israel, which includes Jews and non-Jews who are all citizens of Israel. So for me, that's part of my Zionism. So we're accepting this Zionism as this discriminatory ideology. Unfortunately, sometimes it's expressed that way. But Zionism is about the Jewish people wanting to be a sovereign nation. And a sovereign nation includes building loyalties and relationships to all those who are members of your nation. Every nation is a nation of all of its citizens by definition. That's what a nation means. It's the structure in which all the citizens, anybody who's a member of that, is able to use and have benefit of the various goods, loyalty, etc. So by thinking about sovereignty, I think we could start thinking about your question, Ethan, as an inherent aspect of what it means to be a Zionist, not as a challenge to Zionism, but as an expression. Let Jews grow up. You won the first part. You're safe. Now, what do you want to be as a country? That's what Zionism is about. And I work in shared society. I do work with this tremendous amount of work now with Israeli Arab Palestinians, not despite my Zionism, but because I'm a Zionist.
No, so I want to. I mean, I love what you said, Donniel. It was beautifully expressed, and I really agree with you, right? I mean, the concerns and critiques that I express of Israeli society, for me, are by definition loving critique, and they come from what I think Zionism can be, and the humanistic dimensions of Zionism, which we can see. Many Zionist thinkers who have actually expressed this question, how are the Jews going to be a nation? In some ways, they want to say that's different, right? Which is hard because then we end up sometimes holding ourselves to a very high standard. And some of our fiercest critics hold us to high standards in ways that are not necessarily always constructive or don't always feel like they're in good faith. But I want to extend the problem, and I don't know if push back is the right word, but I want a couple pieces. Number one, I just want us to. Everything you said, I believe, is true about what Zionism should mean in a sovereign nation state. And yet, we know we're living in a period where now, almost 8 years ago, Israel passed a law defining itself as a nation state of the Jews in a way that many Israelis were very upset about. But ultimately, it passed the Knesset. We can talk about all the flaws in the Israeli system, not having a constitution, making something like that much easier to pass than it would have been because of the way basic laws work in the Knesset. But nonetheless, it was a statement. It was a statement that was very powerful and that was very painful for Arab citizens of the country. I heard Mohammed Darasha at the Diller Institute, who's nobody more deeply committed to shared society than him, talk about that as a real pain point for Arab citizens in Israel, which I completely understand, and which throws into doubt how many Zionists see it the way that you and I are saying.
I share that, but I think that legislation was an anti-Zionist legislation, and the people who protested against it the most were the Jabotinskyists.
Right.
Yep. So they were, like I said, what do you think? What do you think it means to be a country? And when I meet, I have these programs for young Palestinian social activists, a leadership program, and one of them asked me, he says, "How could could Zionism ever accept that I had a Nakba?" And I said, Zionism has to accept that you had a Nakba because you're my citizen. And this is the reason why it's good to keep the term, because then I said to him, of course, as a citizen, as someone who I'm loyal to, I have to hear what are the central dimensions of your story, and they have to become part. They have to have room. I said, just like you have to accept that you're living in a country where Jews feel that we've come home. So we have to learn how to live with each other, hear each other, and that's an inner Zionist. You see, my problem is we're running the country like we're diaspora Jews. We've not internalized we think it's like a synagogue. We run state and religion like it's a little shul. We have a chief rabbi who somebody thinks that he's the rabbi of his shul, so he's going to rabbi of everybody else's shul. We haven't internalized the nation business. So the nation state law, you're right. Yeah. Of course I'm fighting against it. Of course my opinion.
Right. Yeah.
But it's an anti-Zionist move, and it's time for us to grow up.
Yes, 1,000%. The problem, I think part of our challenge is, some people argue that in a practical sense, Zionism today is what Israel does. And so they look at things like the nation state law. They look at they look at choices that you and I might call anti-Zionist and say, well, okay, fine, that's great in theory, guys. But here's what Zionism is doing on the ground. I just want to throw in one more piece that I think we have to.
On that, just 1 second, Ethan. Imagine if somebody would say, whatever Israel does is what Judaism is. Imagine. Why should I let them define Zionism? I don't let them define Judaism. So what Jews do doesn't define Judaism, and what Israelis do doesn't define Zionism. But practically, you're right. I appreciate, I'm not
Right.
arguing
And
empirically.
unfortunately, many people in our own community, Donniel, are defensive enough that when people criticize an action of Israel fiercely, even from a position of loyalty or love, they get called anti-Zionist. So that muddies the waters even further in
Correct.
terms of being
Absolutely
able
correct.
to define it. But I just want to also acknowledge, right, that one of the big challenges is we have almost as many um, non-citizens living under Israeli control or sovereignty, that is Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank, and Gaza is obviously a complicated space when we talk about sovereignty, but it is still, significantly controlled by Israel today. And that's something where, I think a lot about what your most regular interlocutor, Yossi Klein Halevi, often says about the responsibilities of Jewish power and the responsibilities of Jewish sovereignty, right? And so I think that's another way to think about what Zionism tells us we have to do vis-a-vis that population that are not even citizens, right? But it's not enough for us to say Zionism has responsibility toward all of the citizens of Israel, because now for more than 50 years, we've been controlling a whole nother population that are not citizens, and that there's no sign will become citizens anytime soon.
I'm hearing in this conversation a question about how the ways in which Zionism lays bare this tension between values and peoplehood, and that's in itself part of this question and debate, right? Does Zionism mean peoplehood at all costs, or does Zionism mean putting Jewish values forward? How do you reconcile those debates within the framework of Zionism, both how you're interpreting it, but also how others are ascribing it?
Right. It's like, yeah, I'll jump in again, following on something, Ethan, that you said, and that is the notion of power. Zionism is about the Jewish people embracing power, not just soft power, but is also hard power. Not just embracing it as a necessity, but as a dimension of what it means to be a full human being. To be a human being is to have the power to change the world and to change your environment and to change your predicament. And as Zionist, I don't apologize for my power. I love my power. I even see power as an essential value. It's part of what it means to be a human being. So many Jews around the world are familiar with the category of tikkun olam. You can't do tikkun olam unless you embrace power. Right? What are you going to do unless tikkun olam is praying for somebody else to repair the world? To repair the world means that you have to get up and you have to have access to power. And sometimes that power is political, and sometimes it's financial. And sometimes, like when we were fighting Hamas, it involves killing people.
Yes.
So that's also tikkun olam. If there's a murderer who's evil, removing their ability to harm people is also tikkun olam. And so Zionism embraces power. And I think it's almost the Jewish people entering into history in the sense that nation states all embrace power, all use it, all embrace it, not only see it as their right, see it as an expression of their fulfillment of their humanity. When God in Genesis 1 creates human beings in God's image, that image, according to the Bible, is the ability to rule the world and master it. To be in the image of God, it means to have power. That's what the Bible means. Now, and that leads to your question. Power is a gift, but power is it always will be corrupted. It's an essential part of that story. Even God's power gets corrupted. God, the master king of the universe, what does God do in Genesis 6? God says, ugh, I hate human beings. I'm going to wipe them out. Okay, really? Yeah, I could do it. And since there's nobody there, Abraham didn't yet come into the world. There's no prophetic voice there telling him, God, really? What are you about to do? So God destroys the world. And what's the first thing that God says after God destroys the world? Oops. God says, oops, I just killed everybody. For what? I'm not going to get a better human race. Human beings are evil at their birth. Yetzer lev ha'adam raminu rab. They're always going to be evil. I'm not going to do this anymore. And since I know I'm prone to temper tantrums, I'm going to put what is it, the rainbow in the sky to remind me. So every time I get angry and I start flooding the world, I'm going to see a rainbow, and I remind myself I have to put limits on my power. Power, as power, it will always to some degree fail. And the challenge of Zionism is not to give up on power, not even to critique its moral necessity, but to constantly be aware that you will always fail. And therefore, it is essential that you have vocal critics at the heart of your leadership, at the heart of your educational, cultural, and political institutions, who are constantly critiquing you, who are your rainbows in the sky, who are the people who are going to tell you, you're going to use it. And if you think that you're going to be the only people who are immune from the failures of power because of some notion of your chosenness, well, you got it wrong. Zionism is going to fail. Zionist power, just like every nation state is, but that doesn't exempt us. We're going to use it, and we're going to constantly, what we have to do is create mechanisms which evaluate how we use it and put forth in front of our people, our army, our institutions, an aspiration to do it better. That's the story of Zionism and power.
There are many more questions here, plus I am seeing questions coming in from the chat. So let me see if we can shoot some out here quickly and also draw from the chat as well. I know you were itching to talk also about the shared society initiatives that you are both part of, that are either umbrellaed within Zionism or seen as an antidote, however you want to approach that. But please tell us where you see conversations opening up. Where are the opportunities? What are the limits? How does that fit into the conversation we're having? Ethan, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, so as we've already heard, I think the conversations are so essential, and I know you share that outlook, Donniel. So there's a program that a number of our listeners are familiar with here at Berkeley called the Berkeley Bridging Fellowship that I helped to create with a colleague and a team of folks in the months after October 7th. And we have a cohort all year of students. This year we have 23 students. It's our second annual cohort. 9 or 10 strongly identify as Jewish or Israeli. 9 or 10 have Palestinian or Arab or Muslim heritage as part of their background. Several people don't have an immediate connection to the conflict, but feel strongly they want to learn how to be in the hard conversations. And we do trainings for how to have hard conversations, how to stretch yourself with a pair of facilitators who are quite remarkable. One Jewish, the other Muslim, and they both spend a great deal of time in the region. And then we do a lot of learning about the history and politics of the conflict with an incredibly wide array of experts. It's very inspiring work for me as an educator and as a Zionist and as a person who cares deeply about Israel and Israel and Palestine. I don't for a range of complicated reasons. I wouldn't define it as a Zionist project because it's a project that's extremely multivocal and has all kinds of perspectives. And one of the definitional ways we set it up was that basically no perspective is off limits. A certain level of mutual respect is essential, but there's no tone policing. There's no policing of who can speak in what way they can speak. And what we see the students develop that is so remarkable is just the capacity to stretch themselves, stretch their views, stretch their perspectives far more than they imagined possible when they walked in the room for the first session that we do. And students will often write about how their loyalties have not necessarily changed, but their capacity to hear the position that they really are more critical of or that's outside their experience has grown enormously. Right? So we had students last year who talked about how either they were Palestinian or they had connections to the Palestinian cause in their family that had really led them to see Zionism as only a story about oppression. And they would write and say, now I understand being a Zionist doesn't mean being loyal to the Netanyahu government. It doesn't mean defending everything Israel does. It's an emancipatory project for Jews historically. It's a story about Jewish culture and Jewish pride. And so even if I'm still very critical of the Israeli state, I don't see Zionism in the same way that I did before. And by the same token, we have very strongly identifying Zionists who have spoken about how they had to face the fact there's another story in this land. There's another people with an equally deep story in this land that they kind of wanted to ignore before, and that their Zionist loyalties haven't weakened, but now they want a more nuanced conversation. I'll tell one quick story about a student who comes from a religious Zionist background, spent the year during which October 7th occurred on their gap year in Israel, watched American campuses from afar, very worried, had people telling them, don't go to Berkeley, withdraw your acceptance, go somewhere else, came to Berkeley ready to be scared and frustrated by all of the noise that they would encounter that would be very different from their view, pro-Palestinian rallies and demonstrations and such. And they found themselves going to the first one that they went to, and they said, I was upset by some of the things I heard. I disagreed with them, but I wasn't triggered. I wasn't angry. I wasn't frustrated. I wasn't scared. And I realized that the skills we're learning in the Bridging Fellowship have given me a different way of interacting with discomfort and disagreement. And this student is now sort of set about the work of having conversations to tell people when you come to college as an American Jew who's a Zionist, there's another way to get yourself ready than thinking that you're going to go convince everybody Israel's always right and always defend Israel. It's getting ready to be in a place where you can have uncomfortable conversations and know that the discomfort is okay. So, it's really inspiring to be able to watch the students.
Thank
In
you.
Israel, 85% of Israeli citizens, 85% of Israeli Arab Palestinians say they don't only want to stay in their ancestral homeland, Palestine, they say they want to remain citizens of Israel. And if there was a Palestinian state, they'd rather stay in Israel than in the Palestinian state. That means we have Israeli Arab Palestinians who are 20% of our country, are loyal, law-abiding citizens of the state and want to have a seat at the table. And the vast majority of Israeli Arab Palestinians and Israeli Jews, they don't know each other. We don't even understand each other. And the best we could do is to somehow put people in the room and play soccer and maybe eat hummus and maybe sing a little bit. And but we stay away from all the difficult issues, Ethan, that you were mentioning, because they immediately create the schisms that we want to somehow bridge. And we've chosen another methodology that if you're bringing people together, but the key issues that you care about aren't on the table, then you're not really bringing them together. They're together physically, but you're not really growing. And our challenge is how do we create an Israeli Jewish population which sees and understands Israeli Arab Palestinians, and how do Israeli Arab Palestinians see and understand Israeli Jews? And even more than that, how do we get Israeli Jews to have a definition of their sovereign national identity, which includes 20% who are non-Jewish? And how do we get Israeli Arab Palestinians to have a theory about what their Israeliness means? Because, Chuck, what does it mean? How do we understand this collective life? And so this has become one of the most significant things that we do, because for me, this is the biggest test for the future of Zionism. Ethan, again, you spoke about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And I know that since we have power over them, we can't simply say, it's not on my account. They're not citizens, it doesn't. But I'm aware of the fact that even though I yearn for a two-state solution, I might not be able to get a two-state solution. That it's not only up to me. When 80% of Palestinians in the West Bank think that October 7th was a good day, it makes future possibilities of peace kind of difficult. But that's not the case among Israeli Arab Palestinians. There's a universal condemnation of October 7th. Universal. Every one of them also understood that Israel has a right to go to war. At some point during the war, they condemned and rejected the way Israel was fighting the war. It's a perfectly legitimate position. And they're trying to figure out what place they have in our country. And so this is a winnable. If Zionism is truly going to be about the moral use of power and about sovereignty, which is not just an inner Jewish conversation, but sovereignty which involves the relationship of Jews with all of our fellow citizens, our shared society work is going to be the test whether Zionism has value and is succeeding. And so I could regale you with like hundreds of stories, but I'll leave it at that. This is literally some of the holiest work that I do. And when I travel all over and speak to and engage, I'll just once this groups come to my home, and this young Israeli Palestinian Arab woman said to me, Rabbi Hartman, why are you doing this? And I said to her, what do you mean, why am I doing this? You're my people. And she starts to cry. She says, I never met a Jew who means well by me, who wants good for me. So then I started to cry. So this is what we got to change. This is winnable. It's in our hands. We don't have to wait for the Abraham Accords and I don't have to wait for transformation. The people are there. Now we just have to embrace the possibilities.
There are several threads in what you've been saying and in the questions that I have, and also in questions that I am seeing in the chat. So I'm going to throw them out at you, and I'm hoping that we can address them one by one. We haven't really talked about anti-Semitism yet in full, and the questions around anti-Semitism, what role it's playing today, what are the conversations happening around it, how you see the boundaries between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I see several questions in the chat relating to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and the boundaries and distinctions there. That's one big question. Certainly, when we talk about shared society, I think we need to talk about democracy and pluralism, as these are aspects of this conversation. And so I want to ask you also, where should Jews be engaging around these conversations of democracy and pluralism, both in Israel and in the United States as well? So I know those are two different pieces, but I want to get them out there. And there's one other I'm going to throw out there right now, just because I want to make sure we use this time and that I address a question that has come up over and over in the chat, which is the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. And I think some questions have reacted, I think, Donniel, to the way you've thought about diaspora Jews, even the description of Israel behaving like it's a diaspora Jew, the government behaving like they're, a shul or diaspora. So I wonder if you can think about where Jews in the diaspora fit into this conversation and relationship with Israel and with Zionism. I know those are three big things, but go for it.
Ethan?
Okay, yes, so, right. We could hold a forum on each of those topics quite easily. I'll just throw out some things on each of them, and we can get into a flow, hopefully. Anti-Semitism is, in my view, it's a tremendous challenge as an actual clearly rising force, not just for the last 2.5 years. We can see it for a decade now in the United States and for longer in parts of Europe. But certainly it has accelerated dramatically since October 7th. And the conversation about anti-Semitism is itself a great challenge. And Donniel, I know you've been talking and thinking about this sort of two-sided part of it as well. And part of our challenge in the Jewish community right now is connected to are arguments about the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. We mentioned earlier the Jewish Federations of North America survey that came out. In that same survey, where 37% of people said they're Zionists, while around 90% said they believe in the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish democratic state, 48% of people said I'm not Zionist, I'm not anti-Zionist, and I'm not non-Zionist, right? Which is, I think, an expression also of just how sort of confused by these categories people are. Another study that was just done by this group for argument's sake, where they interviewed in great depth, I think about 30 or some anti-Zionists, right, who are Jewish. And basically they said most of our assumptions about anti-Zionist Jews that are bandied about, that they don't know anything about Judaism, that they're not engaged with Israel, that they've never been engaged with Israel, that they disengage from the community, most of these felt disproven by how many people here have a whole story of a journey and in many ways still deeply engaged with Israel in a very critical way. A couple of the people interviewed were rabbis. So people who define themselves as anti-Zionists within the Jewish community, that's a growing force, and also people who just aren't comfortable with any of the labels. And so, Donniel, you're aware, I wrote a piece in Sources recently where I tried to give us the beginning of a taxonomy for thinking about different types of
a great article, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donniel. But what I tried to do there was give us some kind of a taxonomy for thinking about this relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I distinguish what I call critical anti-Zionists who are still in a sort of spirit of engagement, and negationist anti-Zionists who are much more in a spirit of just dehumanizing and denying Israel's right to exist in any form as a place of Jewish sovereignty. And I think that we need to be, if we're going to talk about anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, we need to make distinctions. We cannot operate from this place of sweepingly saying that anti-Zionism means you're anti-Semitic, or, as some people want to claim, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are completely separate things. There's a bright red line between the two. Don't confuse them. So this whole conversation is shadowed by those debates, and I think we need to have greater clarity, and we need to acknowledge that anti-Semitism is a rising force as a problem, and the constant invoking of anti-Semitism is a problem that is taking a huge amount of attention in our community, and that is also causing more division in our community. In some ways, that's connected.
Ethan, can I suggest that instead of doing all three?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you. Yeah, you jump in.
Is that okay? Because
it's much better. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
so I won't, because I agree with and I really appreciate your article and Sources was really important for me to give. I had an instinct, and you gave a language as you just summarized, that on the one hand, you can't say that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and you can't say that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Like, you just can't. Like, you can say anything you want to, and people say anything they want to, but you just can't. The truth is, you just can't. And if I go back to what I spoke about at the beginning, about what's on my mind, anti-Semitism fits into the same story. And in many ways, Jews around the world are having Israeli experiences of fear. In North America, Jews in other communities have had that beforehand. But in Israel, living with fear is an integral part of our existence. It's actually an interesting paradox, because Israel sells itself as the only place that Jews are safe. It's like very funny. We're the solution. There's Holocaust, and then there's redemption. In Israel's redemption, when actually Jews in Israel lived with levels of fear that most Jews around the world didn't have any, had no connection to. Like, we know on an ongoing basis that I'm walking in the midst of people who want to kill me. So the experience of anti-Semitism now, let's just speak about North America as one that we're speaking more about now than we did in the past, is because more Jews are just worried. We're just worried. And that's part of the conversation. We're worried. And how do you live with being worried is a very, very big deal. And so the first thing you have to do when you're worried is to protect yourself. And what are the things that Jews have to do to be able to mitigate, control, minimize the impact of anti-Semitism on their lives? And if it entails, even though in most cases it doesn't entail literal physical danger or existential danger, it's significant, and Jews don't poo-poo anti-Semitism. It's there, and you have to worry about it. But at the same time, Anti-Semitism is a great mediocritizer because it concentrates all of our conversation. And it doesn't leave you the psychological space to think about who you want to be. And you're at being mode and not who you want to be mode. And that's so, and of course you have to worry. But at the end of the day, Jewish survival is both a value and an aspiration. And so how does anti-Semitism not shrink the attention span? One of the things I like, Rebecca, about your questions and this whole conversation is we only got to anti-Semitism an hour after we started.
Mhm.
In the Jewish community, it's always the first thing that we start. It's where we start. But what about anti-Semitism? There's an hour. We have to be frightened about that. It's just like worrying about survival is a mediocritizer that moves you away from the reason why you want to survive. And balancing that is an art, and it's I just want to warn, like, take it from somebody who's in Israel, who's been in it for a long time. It's a very difficult process. But now back to you, Ethan, for the next, or Rebecca.
Yeah. I want to bring you back to moving away from anti-Semitism. Then I want to bring you back
A
to
pleasure.
the conversations about democracy and pluralism. Because again, I see that there are these tensions when we think about Jewish values, Jewish peoplehood, and broader values like democracy and pluralism, and whether we can always uphold all of them at once and how Jews are grappling with that. And I think the question might look different in Israel from in the United States, how Jews are grappling with these questions about democracy, pluralism, whether they're feeling included, excluded, sort of leaning more towards extremism versus sort of these are the questions I want you to raise.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would just, in some ways, both in the United States and Israel, and in my view right now, one of the greatest enemies of fighting for democracy and pluralism is Jewish fear for safety, Jewish fear in some cases of other or difference, legitimate Jewish fears around safety in many cases, particularly in Israel. The United States, of course, we have some people who are very motivated to fight for pluralism and democracy by fear of what I think is empirically the most authoritarian government that we've seen, certainly in my lifetime. Um, and at the same time, we have many people who are cowering from speaking, partly out of fear of that government, but also out of a set of fears that governing coalition, frankly, came to power in part by stoking, right? And when, the administration goes to college campuses and says, anti-Semitism is a big problem here, so we're going to punish you, it is relying upon and stoking simultaneously Jewish fear, right? And so part of how we struggle for democracy and pluralism is figuring out a way to not let our fears control us. Because I think in many ways our fears have controlled a lot of the conversation around anti-Semitism, around Jewish belonging, around Jewish peoplehood, around how we define boundaries of community since October 7th. Again, some of those fears are really legitimate. We had to think about safety and security, and sometimes we had to think about boundaries of community in hard ways. But when we talk about democracy and pluralism in the United States, I think one of the things that scares me the most right now is we have the most openly anti-Semitic forces on the right, on parts of the mainstream right in America that we've seen in my lifetime, which often actually are now spouting anti-Zionism in a very overtly anti-Semitic way about Zionist control of the world. And where we would, as Jews, historically find our most natural allies is on the left, among other people who are fighting for democracy and fighting against different forms of discrimination or oppression. But the degree to which a certain kind of dehumanizing anti-Zionism has become a major presence in the activist left in this country, particularly over the last 2.5 years, makes it harder for us as Jews to say we need your help, because we unfortunately have been cast as powerful and privileged in connection to what is cast as an oppressor state by many, many people on the activist left. And so where we find our allies in a fight for democracy that is inseparable from our own rights and our own place in this country is in some ways more complicated than ever. So, but I think to go back to the element of fear, we can't let those fears mean we don't fight for democracy anymore. You're going to maybe talk about that in Israel, Donniel, where I believe that as well. But being most familiar with the American context, that's what I'm focused on. But we can't let the fear of the conversations that are hard mean we don't try to build allies where we need them and maybe where we can build them if we're willing to be in brave conversation.
Now, I actually want to stay on the American and Canadian side. Because in Israel, it's not really a challenge of peoplehood and values. Democracy is a Jewish value, and Israel's, in some cases, is a vibrant democracy, and in some cases is an underachieving democracy. And where it's underachieving, we have to work better, and we have to uproot. Again, a key dichotomy in Israel is: do you believe Israel should be a Jewish state or it should be a democratic state? Mm-hmm. An integral part of Hartman teaching, and I don't mean Donniel Hartman, I mean the whole Hartman Institute, is that Israel, which is less democratic, is less Jewish. Instead of it being seen as a choice between two opposites. But when you come to the challenges that you're facing now, between who are your allies and do you speak up and not speak up, most moral life, most of our struggles are never between good and evil. We wish our life, we could pick between what do you want to do? Do you want to be good or you want to be evil? Very often it's life just doesn't give us those choices. It's a mess. Life is a mess. And today our allyship in America is a mess. We don't know what to be frightened of. We don't know which side to be frightened of. We don't know which side scares us. We hear, I hear Tucker Carlson or I hear J.D. Vance and I'm petrified one way, and then I hear AOC, I'm petrified on the other side. And you just don't know which one to be frightened from more and what compromises you should make, and as Michael Walzer speaks about, all political life involves dirty hands. Mm. It's going to involve dirty hands, and Avishai Margalit speaks about rotten compromises. And the only thing I'd encourage all of us when it comes to struggling now is don't come up with a theory, because it do the best you can at any given day about what seems to be right. So, if you're in Minnesota and they're shooting people, or if when that comes up, there's, you can't be silent. There's moments where it just doesn't matter. And there's moments when, yes, it does matter. And are you being consistent? Consistency has never been a profound moral virtue in any event. And just I think people have to give themselves a break to know that we are in the midst, not of an unprecedentedly complex time, but it's unprecedented in the sense that our answers weren't prepared for this array of questions. And so just know you're going to be inconsistent, know that you're going to be a mess, have some lines that you don't cross most of the time. And just at the end of the day, try to maintain your sense of decency and your sense of moral aspiration to the best of your ability. That would be my rabbinic advice to people, with no judgment involved.
I'm going to bring you back to another question that I flagged, that many people commented in the chat, just about that relationship with the diaspora and Israel, sort of around Jewish values, around Jewish peoplehood. Are diaspora Jews being dismissed by the state, or even by sort of the way you're framing things? Sort of how would you understand that relationship?
Okay, I'll start here, Ethan. Is that okay?
Good. Yeah.
When I said that Israel's acting like diasporic Jews, I meant 19th century diasporic Jews, pre-state. We forgot, and the old diaspora Jews were Jews who were powerless, who were never accepted as citizens, had very marginal impact on their societies, and basically were never embraced as full citizens, and goal was basically to survive. Part of what's changed in the United States and Canada is that, at least in my estimation, Jews in the United States and Canada, I don't even use the word diaspora anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They're not in the diaspora. They're at home. And we're Jews of power. We might not have hard power, but we have soft power and influence, and we use it. The United States and Canada aren't the same to that degree, but the United States, together with Israel, are the most powerful Jewish communities in the world, where we have a responsibility and a possibility, not just to worry about our own well-being, but about the nature of the country in which we live and what we want it to be. So now, this creates great challenges, because when you have two powerful, dignified communities, you get into these little competitions about who's the center, who's more important, who's being respected. Do you see me? Do you not see me? All of the above. Now, the nature of any long distance relationship, which is what we are, we're a 6 to 10,000 mile long distance relationship, is there's going to be profound lack of understanding, lack of appreciation, lack of nuance. That's going to be inevitable. Now, in Israel has to accept that the Jews around the world are at home, but it also has to accept another dimension. And that is that if Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people and not just the homeland of the citizens of Israel, that means that Jews around the world have a stake and a place in this country and determining what it should do. Now, I'm not interested in any Jew outside of Israel, whether they have regardless of what citizenship they have and whether they were also Israeli, to vote and to decide when Israel should go to war and when there should be a ceasefire and whether my kids should live or die. I'm not interested in that. But that there has to be a sense that Israel belongs to all Jews and that all Jews have to have a sense that they are respected and that their concerns, and this goes back to anti-Semitism, whatever it is, that what Israel does impacts on world Jewry has to be an integral part of what Israel thinks about when it tries to determine its internal and external policies and actions. Ethan, I think it's last word for you.
So I appreciate everything that you said, Donniel. I think that we underestimate dramatically the degree to which diaspora Jewry and Israeli Jews need each other. And I don't mean materially, although it's really important. There's all kinds of institutions in the diaspora that are created and supported by the Israeli state, and there's all kinds of material ways in which Jews, particularly in this country, but also in other places, are helping to support Israeli entities and institutions. I mean at a deeper level. I mean really at the level of consciousness and engagement. What you spoke about as your Zionism, which I think we substantially share the same Zionism, Donniel, is in some ways a Zionism that is inflected with what many people and what to some degree I would call a diaspora consciousness. It's a consciousness of our experiences in diaspora. It's a consciousness of what it means to live in diaspora. It's a consciousness of a historical arc where we were desperate for a homeland that we were connected to for 2,000 years and that also represented for us safety and sovereignty. When we don't have that diaspora consciousness, we are more likely to make choices that are at odds with fundamental values of democracy and Zionism as you and I understand it. And by the same token, we have to recognize so many people in our diaspora communities now are so deeply tied to Israel and feel deeply loyal to Israel. And Israel's their first loyalty as a Jew. And when we don't hear those people and see those people and the way they can be at odds with certain parts of our community and feel really challenged by things going on in our communities, then we are creating schisms and we're not listening. So, that to me, that is something that we need to make that effort to understand how much we are part of each other's communities and worlds, particularly when we're at our best.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I think this is a perfect place to close. Thank you, Donniel. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you to everyone who joined us today for this conversation, which was incredible and timely. And I wish you all well.
Thank you, Donniel. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, and
Thank
thanks,
you.
Rebecca.